Hey, good morning. This is Richard Hsu, host of Hsu Untied. This morning, I'm really thrilled to have with me as my guest Rafael Langer-Osuna, who's a partner at Squire Patton Boggs. Rafael, welcome to the program.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, this is the first time I've ever actually been nervous saying a person's name, but it sounds like I got it okay.
Yeah, you nailed it.
So, Rafael, you have one of the most interesting educational backgrounds I've come across, and I'm not even talking about law school. Tell me a little about some of the things you've done and, where you grew up and how you ended up going to so many interesting schools around the world.
Yeah, well, I grew up in a globalized world. I grew up with my father speaking German to me. He's a Latin American history professor, so I grew up being spoken German to in Bolivia. So I started learning German, Spanish, English roughly at the same time. Came to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania when I was really young, and that's a college town that I was pretty integrated in the college environment. So I've always been fascinated by learning. I've always been fascinated by the world. For me, it was always a globalized world. So I've been had a long interest in learning how the world works. And that, combined with my love of learning, led me to jump at the opportunity when I was first offered to go to Nanjing to study environmental engineering for a summer. So it wasn't an engineering degree. Right after my junior year in high school. So that was an opportunity I could not pass up. And the idea of adding Chinese to my background, to all the other languages I knew, was highly appealing as well, because then I'd be getting a good chunk of the United Nations languages, and I'd be able to speak with a good chunk of people around the world. So jumped at that opportunity, was absolutely fascinated, loved what I saw, what I learned. It was quite the experience to learn Chinese, to study what was going on environmentally in China at that time, in the late 90s. We flew into Shanghai and it was just all skyscrapers. And then went to Nanjing and, studied Chinese, studied what was going on environmentally. Then from there, went to Carnegie Mellon University and studied a number of subjects: neuroscience, cognitive psychology, history, cultural psychology, and realized that I had to knit those things all together. So I sat down with one of the advisors and I said, I think I'd like to come up with a self-defined major in human nature. His not inappropriate response was, and what are you going to do with that degree? And I said, well, obviously more school. And he kind of shrugged and let me do it.
That's so interesting. Let me, this is so interesting already. Well, first of all, let's begin. How many languages do you speak?
Presently, I speak English, Spanish, German, and Chinese.
Okay. And pretty, obviously, are they you're pretty fluent in those three? You can have business conversations and everything?
I can have business conversations in German and Chinese, but it's been a very long time since I've used them on any kind of daily basis. So it does take me a little while to get kind of back in the flow of things. I trip over the grammar sometimes. Spanish I've actually used in the courtroom, and as well as English, obviously. And I feel relatively comfortable doing that with both Spanish and English. German and Chinese, it would take me a little while before I was going to use that in the courtroom. Those are languages where I'm more apt to just kind of sit there quietly, not necessarily having the other side or whoever know that I speak the language, and then drop in a word or two indicating that I just understood everything you said.
It must be fun. Do you speak do you have any language that kind of not so well, or any other?
I've worked with a number of Japanese clients, and so I've definitely picked up some Japanese along the way. The written language in East Asia is common, shared written language originally, and then everyone kind of evolved their own versions of it. So having a facility with written Chinese gives you a leg up on Japanese, Korean, Vietnamese, except to the extent that, everyone's now relying on their own new way of writing. But you can still often see a lot of the Chinese characters underlying those languages around.
So you can read Chinese characters then, huh?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty impressive. Interesting. Okay, well, continue on. So you, Carnegie Mellon, obviously a fantastic school. So you graduate with a degree in human nature. What do you do with that? As your advisor asked you, what did you do with that?
The next step was to try to figure out what to do with it. So I went to DC, got an internship at the United Nations Foundation, and concurrently an internship with the Coalition for Smarter Growth. So I was studying sustainable development at the workplace, as well as sort of international aid at the United Nations Foundation. I worked there for a few months, and then I decided that it was time for that more school. I had a very interesting conversation with a professor by the name of Elliot Turiel in Berkeley, who I was introduced to by my then fiance. We hit it off. We had this just really quick, deep intellectual rapport. We just started talking about things, and I had I knew I was going to speak with him, so I looked at some of what he had written, and he works in an area of moral and social development. And what he studied was sort of how people decide between what's right and wrong in various different cultures. And his theory is that there are things that are moral and things that are social conventions and things that are practical. And so we started talking about that. And I thought it was this really fascinating way of thinking about the way different societies deal with power, deal with harm, deal with issues of what we typically call morality. And so we just immediately hit it off. And he said, apply to be my student. I said, okay, I'm there. I applied to the PhD program at the Graduate School of Education, get accepted, and we're off to the races on that more education that I told my advisor in undergrad that I'd be needing.
And this is at Berkeley now we're talking about.
Yes.
All right. So you're in the PhD program at Berkeley, and then what happens?
Well, and then I have a kid. Basically, I have a kid, and concurrently, I am spending time in these like small graduate student lectures and reading discussion groups and whatnot. And I'm realizing that I'm having more time, having more fun, spending time arguing about which theorist is right. This is the correct way of thinking about this, than I am having an interest in sort of iteratively tweaking a very specific question and kind of reapproaching that over and over again with the data. And I thought about that for a while, and arguing about who's right and wrong, that's what a litigator does, I would come to realize. But iteratively tweaking and continuing to ask a similar question until you get a deeper and richer answer, that's what I would be doing if I were to get the PhD, if I were to continue down that path. And so I look into this, and I'm like, oh, well, if I go to law school, I can argue about who's right, I can get paid to do it, and I can win those arguments too. Like, there will be someone at the end of the day who says, actually, yes, you are right, and this person is less right. And so it seemed like a no-brainer at that point. I applied to Duke. I told people what I was doing at Berkeley, and they said, okay, well, just wrap up these projects that you're doing and you can get the master's degree, and then proceed on to Duke to get the law degree.
How far were you into your thesis when you wrapped up, or were you just starting it?
This was on the second year. Okay. So I was just starting to formulate what the real question would be that I would be examining.
Just out of curiosity, what was your thesis going to be on if you had completed it?
It was something, I was thinking about something called goal context coordination, which was a way of looking at the way community movements could interact with the power structure to find a way to affect social change. And I was going to look at that through the developmental lens to see how you could sort of meet these three levels of, the individual level of thinking about social change, thinking about what's right and wrong, how that intersects with the community level of how people will get together and make decisions about that in a group that's trying to get something done, and then taking that into a broader political context, like a city, a state, and a nation, to actually affect the change that needs to be affected. So that's what I was going to look at, and I'm still looking at that in some ways. That is the practice of the law in some ways.
Right. So tell me, so when you got to law school, was it everything you imagined it was going to be? Was it exactly like, wow, did you feel like a fish in a duck to water? Like, wow, this is great? Or what was it like?
I think the most magical thing about Duke Law was getting into this space with this highly curated group of people who were all extremely intelligent, all dedicated to doing something with the world, and all there to really seriously learn. And so that was just duck to water would be a great way of thinking about it. Another way of thinking about it would be almost like reaching an oasis in a desert and finding the water and just starting to drink, because the UC Berkeley environment was amazing. I loved my colleagues. I loved the other students I was working with, but there wasn't the same. The ambition was different. The particular ambition at Duke to really do something in the world, engage with power, was very different, and that combination with the intellectualism, which had been deep at UC Berkeley, was really enticing.
Did you specifically choose Duke for that, or not?
I chose Duke actually because they had a JDMA program, so I could continue this sort of personal vein of study that I'd been doing at the same time as my law school. So I actually enrolled to the JDMA program so that I could concurrently earn a master's in East Asian Studies.
Wow. So if you count how many years, after you finished law school and this program, if you count how many years of school did you do after college?
5.
5. Okay.
Yeah.
That's actually not as bad as that. Okay.
I packed a lot in.
Yeah. But you must love school. You must love academics. Okay, I get that. So what brought you?
Love learning.
Yeah. So you graduated from law school. What brings you back? It sounds like you came back out to California. Do I have that wrong?
Graduate from law school, actually ended up with a job down in Miami.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Right after law school, moved down to Miami. I happened to get an interview with a guy by the name of Lou Murphy at the firm that I'm at currently, actually. So Squire Patton Boggs. It was then Squire Sanders and Dempsey.
Right.
And Lou and I sit down over basically lunch.
Yeah.
I don't know what we're going to be talking about.
Right.
This is actually, I think this was my first and only series of interviews for a law firm. When I see something that I like, I just go for it.
Yeah.
And Lou and I, we start talking about history. And we're talking about Roman philosophy, Stoicism, Epicureanism over lunch. We're not talking about any of the questions I had nervously prepared for as a law student, like, I'm a summer associate, how do I get this, like, how do I prove, At the end, he asks, like, how's your GPA? I'm like, well, it's pretty good, but, it could be better, but I'm doing this master's in East Asian Studies. Like, well, maybe you want to focus on that. And he's like, but I think this will work out. And then the next interview I do is with Digna French, who is still my colleague at Squire Patton Boggs. And we sit down and we talk about vegetarianism, of all things. And I'm like, this is amazing. These people are well, nerds in the best possible way. I'm like, this is perfect. This is exactly the kind of place I want to be. People who are interested in the world and really thoughtful about how they live in the world.
Sounds like you got kind of lucky, actually. I mean, you could have interviewed at many firms and not discovered this. I mean, you recognize that now, I'm sure. It sounds like you got really lucky.
Oh yeah, I mean, I honestly think my entire career has been, one lucky opportunity after the other. I mean, the only role I played in it was seeing it for what it was and taking it. I'm like, oh, this is good. I'm going.
Yeah. So how did you end up in California then? It sounds like you're in California now. You're in San Francisco Bay Area. How did you end back here then?
So a couple of years, 4 or 5 years into working at Squire and doing litigation, doing some really interesting work on behalf of some foreign governments, stuff like that. My then wife gets a job offer from Stanford, which is kind of an offer you can't refuse, right? It's Stanford. It is the be all end all of academia, tenure track position. So I approach the powers that be at the firm and say, hey, so this thing is happening. Is there room in the Squire office in San Francisco? They look at it, they come back to me and say, yeah, come on over. So I spend that summer studying for the California bar and then head on over and hit the ground running out here in San Francisco with some really interesting antitrust litigation and other things.
And of course, you'd already lived in Berkeley, so you know the Bay Area already. So that wasn't that new, right? You already were at Berkeley, right? So
that's right. But we ended up in the peninsula, which is an entirely different planet. It's across the bay, and so it's not the same part of the Bay Area by any means. So there was still a little bit of a learning curve in the area, but same area, same location.
Interesting. So tell me about your practice now. What is your practice now? What is your practice? Describe your practice currently.
So I focus on 2 different areas that sometimes overlap. But the first is litigating matters that arise over the internet. So right now, the big ones are data breach, data privacy type litigations. There are lots of class actions out there. Basically, any kind of security flaw in a company's presence online can lead to any kind of possible litigation. And there are a wide variety of statutes out there that really ought not to apply. And thankfully, successfully, my team said we've argued that they don't apply, but that plaintiffs' lawyers are looking to make apply because they've got these big statutory penalties and things like that. So there's that. There's online copyright infringement, software licensing, all of the things that can cause disputes over the internet. That's one set of types of disputes that I handle. And the other set of disputes that I handle are disputes for and against foreign sovereigns. So that's its whole own kettle of fish. I mean, there are all sorts of issues with sovereign immunity, with the active state doctrine, with the coordination of litigation across multiple fronts that arise in those contexts. And that both of those areas really fascinate me.
How did you get into the foreign sovereign litigation? That seems pretty remote and esoteric. How did you get into that?
I jumped right in from the first day. So with the language ability, I showed up and I said, hey, yeah, I speak and read legal Spanish. And, eyes went wide, and before I knew it, there was a physical box of documents on my desk. Here's this stuff that we received from the client that is in this really, intense legal Spanish. There are a lot of jurisdictions in Latin America that still rely on the sort of comes now the plaintiff, Oya's kind of like old language that is really formulaic. 2 pages later, after you've introduced the bailiffs second grandfather and the identification number of like the plaintiff's third cousin, you get to the substance of the material. So you got to have a familiarity with that, and it's going through that I really ended up getting involved in that and just kind of working my way up from there.
Isn't most of that stuff? Doesn't that mostly stuff is arbitration, right? Or does that actually go to litigation?
There's a lot of arbitration. I've ended up specializing in the side that goes to litigation in state and federal courts.
Oh, interesting. Now, you said that there's some overlap. Those sound like totally disparate practices. Tell me the overlap of those two.
Well, every once in a while, there are cybersecurity, internet, data privacy issues that arise between the intersections of foreign sovereigns and U.S. and people who can sue in U.S. courts. And that stuff gets very interesting. A lot of the things I've worked on are sort of behind the scenes kinds of things that I can't really talk about because thankfully no one knows about them. It's part of what I do. But when it does come into court, it's really fascinating stuff to work on because you have all this intersection between a national polity or a city or something somewhere else that's trying to basically affect the needs and desires of a group of people, right? It's never just one person, and they have very political interests, but they're trying to do the best for themselves. And then they intersect with, the internet here in the US and various internet laws. And then you have this fascinating, very complex, 4-dimensional chessboard of all the jurisdictional issues and all the internet data issues and the way that information flows or doesn't flow across international borders.
Interesting. Well, listen, obviously it sounds like you love what you do. Do you ever think about, that you can't imagine that you'd be doing this, the Rafael that was studying human nature in Carnegie Mellon and all these classes, like, does it ever, like, you ever kind of pinch yourself and think, wow, I never dreamed I'd be a lawyer litigating, or what do you think?
Oh, I definitely, there are a lot of my colleagues who were, set on this is the path I'm going on. It's going to be the law from day one. I think when I was talking to that advisor in undergrad, I think I rattled off a number of different, additional avenues of schooling. Law school was like, fourth on the list as sort of something I threw in there because, that's another secondary school you can go into. It was not what I was thinking would be the case.
Well, I think it's so interesting. I really like the story about how you told about how, you're studying for your PhD, and it was more the discourse and the persuasion that actually got you thinking about this. It just seems like such an odd way to come to this profession, but it just shows you how in life you just never know what it is that, ends up steering you in that direction. You're in a PhD program, why would you think that? Anyways,
they are really different discourses, really different ways of handling language.
So tell me, Rafa, so obviously you have such an interesting background. Obviously you've got an interesting practice. Do you see yourself ever doing anything else? Like, is there a third thing in your future that will somehow combine these two things or do something? What else? You have such an interesting mind, it seems like, and a curious mind.
Well, what I've really enjoyed since coming out as non-binary in 2019 has been the work I've been doing on behalf of and with the trans and non-binary community, because there's a lot of need there, but also a lot to work on with respect to social change and just making sure that people have their rights. So there is sort of an intersection there. And it's been really fascinating and amazing, actually, to work with Bay Area Lawyers for Individual Freedom here locally in the San Francisco Bay Area, the National Trans Bar Association nationally, and various colleagues on those kinds of issues, working on amicus briefs, working to affect change with respect to federal and state regulation, as well as dealing with online media events. So those have been some of the things that have been really making me feel like having gone all the way to get partner, climbing all the way up that ladder has been extremely worthwhile, because I've reached this point where I've gone through to go back to like what I was studying in undergrad, where I was looking at the individual psychology, the community level, and the sort of government level, where I'm at this intersection between the community and government level, where I can actually interface directly with the various stakeholders and make things happen, make change happen, make connections between people who can then go on to make positive changes in society.
That's so cool, Rafael. Listen, I really appreciate your taking the time. I love how you've knitted all that together. It was an interesting story. I do a lot of these interviews, but I really enjoyed speaking with you, and I really appreciate your taking the time.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
This is Richard Hsu and Rafael Langer-Osuna. Thanks.